On the day I turned 18, my family handed me a box. It was small, almost insultingly, so wrapped in the same glossy silver paper my mom, Karen, insisted on using every year, as if recycling the same traditions would somehow make us feel like a real family. My chest tightened, a flicker of fragile hope sparking inside me. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe they would actually see me for once. I tried to smile, but it came out crooked, shaky. Across the worn dining room table, Mom stood stiffly, arms crossed like a barrier I was never meant to cross. Her expression was as closed off as ever, her eyes cold and hard to read, like she had already decided how this night was going to play out. Ashley, my sister, lounged in her chair like she owned the world, twirling her perfect blonde hair between her fingers, her face twisted in that perpetual look of boredom she wore whenever she wasn't the center of attention. She let out a loud, exaggerated yawn, making sure I saw it. My little brother Tyler was already snickering under his breath, his gaze darting to Ashley as if waiting for her signal. I saw her lean over, whisper something into his ear. He giggled like a kid in on a cruel prank. Uncle Frank, Mom's deadbeat brother, who had been camping out in our basement for the past few years, stretched back in his chair with that smug, greasy grin spread wide across his face. The same look he wore whenever he could smell humiliation in the air, as long as it wasn't aimed at him. In the corner, barely a shadow, sat Grandpa Walter. His weathered hands rested neatly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the cheap grocery store cake in the middle of the table like it held some kind of secret. He didn't look at me. He never did when things were about to turn ugly. And I guess he already knew this night would be no different. The box felt weightless in my hands, too, light, way too light. My fingers trembled just a little as I tugged at the ribbon, the silky knot slipping loose with almost no resistance. I tried to keep my face blank, rehearsed. But inside, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. I peeled back the paper, lifted the lid, and there it was. Nothing. No present, no heartfelt card, just a plain folded scrap of paper. For a split second, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a clue. A game, a scavenger hunt, something clever. But that fragile glimmer of hope shattered the second I unfolded the note and read the 5 words scrawled in angry, messy handwriting. Try being useful for once. The room froze, and then Ashley let out a cackle, sharp and gleeful. Even her presence empty, she sneered, her voice loud enough to make sure the insult bounced off the cheap wallpaper. Just like her life. The laughter exploded around me like fireworks of cruelty. Tyler laughed along, eager to join in, eyes shining with approval from Ashley. Uncle Frank slapped his knee and wheezed like he'd just heard the punchline to the world's best joke. And Mom. She didn't laugh, but I caught the tiniest curl of her lips. It was worse than laughter. It was approval. I couldn't move. My stomach twisted itself into knots so tight I thought I might throw up right there at the table. The note dangled from my fingers, crumpling slowly as my grip tightened. My face burned, and I couldn't tell if it was from fury, humiliation, or both twisting together like poison vines inside me. I stared at them, all of them, and the only thought that echoed through my head was, this is what I am to them. A joke, an inconvenience, an empty box. Ashley beamed at me like a predator watching her prey bleed out. Her eyes locked on mine, daring me to cry to break to give her that satisfaction. But I wouldn't. Not in front of her. My throat tightened, my voice caught like a stone lodged there, but I swallowed it back down. My hands shook now, but I forced myself to set the box down, gently, carefully, pretending I was calm, pretending I wasn't unraveling. I didn't say a word. What was there to say? Instead, I pushed back my chair. My legs felt like they weren't even attached to my body, numb and hollow. But somehow I managed to stand, moving slowly, deliberately. I walked past the table, past the cake. No one had even bothered to ask me what flavor I liked, past their smirks and mocking stares. With each step, my heartbeat roared louder in my ears. I went to the drawer by the kitchen counter and pulled out the envelope, the one I had written the night before, the one I had written just in case tonight turned out exactly like this. I turned around, and for the first time all night the room fell completely silent. Even the laughter stopped. Grandpa Walter finally looked up from his corner, his gaze meeting mine for a brief moment. I walked back to the table, each footstep echoing on the old hardwood floor, like the house itself was holding its breath. I placed the envelope gently in front of Mom. No words, no dramatic flourish, just a calm, steady motion that felt more powerful than anything I could have shouted. Mom's smirk disappeared. Ashley blinked confused, her smile faltering. "What's that supposed to be?" she asked, her voice laced with forced bravado. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I sat back down, folded my hands in my lap, and stared straight ahead. My face was a mask of calm, but inside I was trembling, not from fear this time, but from something unfamiliar. Something that tasted a little like power. Mom picked up the letter slowly, her fingers brushing against the paper like it might bite her. She unfolded it, and the color drained from her face, leaving her looking paler than the frosting on the cake. Funny how some moments in life feel like scenes from a story you'd watch unfold on a screen, those rare, breathless pauses when everything hangs in the balance, and you realize you're standing at the edge of a chapter that might finally change everything. And if you've ever found yourself in one of those moments, or wish you had the words to face your own, I hope you'll take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because stories like mine, messy and raw and a little too real, deserve to be heard. And maybe, just maybe, they'll help someone else find their voice too. The day I turned 18, the air in the Mitchell house hung heavy with that suffocating artificial cheerfulness that always wrapped itself around my birthdays, like the suffocating scent of cheap vanilla candles. They handed me a box, small, almost offensively, so its surface cloaked in the same tacky silver wrapping paper my mother Karen insisted on recycling year after year, as though the predictable shimmer could somehow camouflage the cracks in our fractured family facade. My heart betrayed me in that moment, fluttering in my chest, foolishly kindling a fragile ember of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the year they saw me. Really saw me. The girl standing right there in front of them. I mustered a smile, though it trembled at the edges, refusing to hold itself steady under the weight of my uncertainty. From across the battered oak dining table, Karen stood rigid as a sentry arms folded across her chest like a fortress built to keep me out. Her lips were a flat, grim line, her expression devoid of softness, her eyes distant and impenetrable, as if she had already rehearsed the ending of this hollow little performance. Ashley sprawled in her chair like royalty, slumming it among peasants draped in an attitude of exaggerated boredom, twirling a strand of her perfectly highlighted blonde hair around one manicured finger. Her lips parted in an over-the-top yawn, theatrically loud, as though to announce to the entire room just how little my existence registered on her radar. Tyler, my kid brother, was already stifling laughter behind his hand, his eyes flickering toward Ashley like a loyal pup waiting for her command to attack. I caught her leaning over, whispering something poisonous in his ear, and he snorted the sound sharp and gleeful. Uncle Frank, the permanent resident of our basement, who had long since surrendered to the greasy gravity of his own failure, leaned back in his creaky chair, that same slimy grin stretched across his face, like it had been stapled there since the day he moved in. He thrived on these moments, feeding off them like a vulture circling roadkill, savoring every ounce of someone else's humiliation, as long as the joke wasn't on him. In the shadowy corner of the room sat Grandpa Walter, a quiet, stoic figure who seemed to have merged with the faded armchair beneath him. His gnarled hands rested carefully in his lap. His gaze locked on the store-bought cake in the center of the table, a bland, uninspired slab of frosted vanilla that seemed almost embarrassed to exist. He didn't look at me. He never did when the storm clouds gathered. I suppose he already sensed the brewing storm tonight. The box felt unsettlingly light in my hands, its weight or lack thereof a silent, mocking promise. My fingers shook just enough to betray me as I fumbled with the silky ribbon which unraveled with an effortless slide, as if eager to unveil whatever cruelty waited inside. I forced my face into a mask of disinterest, rehearsed and brittle, but inside my heart pounded so ferociously it threatened to shatter the fragile cage of my ribs. I peeled back the silver paper, lifted the flimsy lid, and found nothing. No present. No message of love or even the perfunctory happy birthday. Just a plain folded scrap of paper lying limp at the bottom like a discarded afterthought. For one foolish heartbeat, my mind scrambled to rationalize it. Maybe it was a game, a puzzle, a clue to something better. But the fragile fantasy shattered the moment I unfolded the note and saw the words scratched across it in angry, jagged ink. Try being useful for once. The room turned to ice. For one suspended breath, nobody moved, nobody dared break the fragile tension. And then Ashley erupted in a peal of delighted laughter, sharp and predatory, cutting through the stillness like a serrated blade. Even her presence empty, she crowed, her voice a weapon designed to wound, just like her pathetic little life. The others followed, like a well-rehearsed choir of cruelty. Tyler giggled, practically glowing under Ashley's approving gaze. Uncle Frank slapped his thigh so hard the old chair groaned in protest, wheezing like he'd stumbled upon the comedic gem of the century. And Karen, she didn't laugh, not outright, but I caught the ghost of a smirk curling the corners of her lips. Somehow that tiny, almost imperceptible smile felt like the cruelest cut of all. It was approval. I sat frozen, the note dangling from my fingertips, crumpling under the tremor in my hand. My stomach twisted itself into a knot so tight it might have strangled the air from my lungs. My cheeks flared hot, flushed with a mingling cocktail of humiliation and rage that boiled beneath the thin veneer of my skin, daring to spill over. I stared at them, every last one of them, and the words repeated in my mind like a curse. This is what I am to them. A joke, an inconvenience, an empty box. Ashley's grin widened into something almost triumphant as she locked her gaze on mine, daring me to cry, daring me to crumble in front of them. But I wouldn't give her that victory. Not tonight. My throat clenched tight, my voice suffocating somewhere deep inside, but I swallowed it down like I had 1,000 times before. My hands trembled, but I placed the box back on the table as delicately as if it were made of glass, as though if I moved too quickly, I might shatter what little remained of my composure. I didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I pushed back my chair. My legs felt detached from my body, numb and hollow, yet somehow they obeyed, carrying me forward in slow, deliberate steps. I moved past the cake, past the sneers and the smug faces, past the toxic laughter still clinging to the stale air. Each footstep echoed on the worn hardwood floors, like the house itself had fallen into an expectant hush. At the kitchen counter, I pulled open the drawer, retrieving the envelope, the letter I had written in the quiet hours of the night, when hope and anger mingled in equal measure. The letter I wrote because deep down I always suspected tonight would end exactly like this. When I turned back toward them, the room fell into a suffocating silence. Even the laughter choked itself off mid-breath. Grandpa Walter lifted his eyes, meeting mine with that same quiet, knowing look he wore when the world around him fell apart. I crossed the room slowly, purposefully, each step punctuated by the hush that now suffocated the house. I placed the envelope directly in front of Karen, no explanation, no preamble, just a steady, calculated motion that felt more powerful than a scream. Karen's smirk faltered, slipping from her face like a mask torn loose. Ashley blinked, her smile flickering into something thinner, more uncertain. "What's that supposed to be?" she asked, her voice teetering on a brittle edge of mockery. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I slid back into my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap, fixing my gaze forward. Outwardly, I remained composed, calm, collected. But inside, I was trembling, not with fear this time, but with something new. Something electric and alive. Something that tasted like power. Karen reached for the envelope, her fingertips brushing the paper cautiously like it might combust in her hands. She unfolded it with slow, deliberate care, and as her eyes skimmed the words, I watched the color drain from her face, leaving her paler than the cake's too sweet frosting. For perhaps the first time in her meticulously ordered life, Karen Mitchell stared down at the letter in her trembling hands as though it were some strange and foreign artifact. Uncertain, wary, not knowing what storm might unfold from the words on the page. That alone was enough to steal the breath straight from my lungs. It was a moment I had never dared imagine, a moment where the woman who always held the upper hand, who dictated the rules of our fractured universe, looked at me not as a shadow, not as a footnote, but as something unpredictable, something she could no longer control. And I held her gaze. I didn't look away. Not this time. My entire life had been shaped by their rules, the unspoken ones that taught me to shrink when the air turned tense, to make myself smaller, quieter, apologetic even when I wasn't sure what I'd done wrong, which was most of the time. But something had cracked open inside me the night before when the house had fallen into its brittle, empty silence, and I sat under the weak glow of my desk lamp, scribbling every aching word onto those pages as if they might be the only thing tethering me to the earth. That night, I didn't write to beg for their understanding or approval. I wrote to tell the truth raw and unvarnished, and if the truth burned them, then good. I had stayed up until 2 in the morning, each word a battle against the insidious voices inside my head, whispering to keep the peace, to swallow the truth, to disappear like I always had. But this time I didn't listen. I couldn't. The words poured from me in a furious, unstoppable stream. Page after page bled from my pen, stories and wounds I had buried so deep they came out jagged, desperate, gasping for air. I wrote about my father, how his death wasn't just a loss, but an earthquake that split our family into fault lines no one bothered to repair. How after he was gone, the house no longer felt like a home, but a battlefield where I was always caught in the crossfire. I wrote about Karen, how her grief calcified into bitterness, how her gaze stopped seeing me altogether, except when it was to tally my failures like unchecked items on a never-ending list. I wrote about Ashley, how every insult masked as a joke weighed me down like invisible stones in my pockets, slowly dragging me under, and how she always got away with it because she was loud, bright, and magnetic, the daughter everyone loved on autopilot. I wrote about Tyler following in her footsteps, mimicking her cruelty, never understanding how deep his careless words cut. I wrote about Uncle Frank turning every moment of pain into a punchline, mocking my softness as though it were a disease. But most importantly, I wrote about the girl I was becoming beyond them. About how 6 months ago, I'd quietly started therapy, slipping into sessions between shifts at the bookstore without telling a soul. How I'd applied to a creative writing program 2 towns over, and had been accepted. How I was saving every dollar from my part-time job, planning my escape, and by the end of the summer, I would be gone. There would be no screaming match, no dramatic exodus, just a simple, irrevocable choice. I was leaving because I refused to spend another year, another minute, trying to prove my worth to people who saw me only as an obligation or a burden. And at the end of the letter, after rewriting it until the ink no longer shook on the page, I left them with one sentence, a final act of defiance, a line drawn in permanent ink. You will no longer have the power to define who I am. That was what Karen Mitchell was reading now. Her eyes crawled over the pages, slow, almost laborious, like each word was a stone in her throat. I saw the flicker, then the crack in her expression as the mask slipped. Her brow furrowed, her mouth compressed into a tight, pale line, and she looked as though she were swallowing something acrid, something she had never tasted before, the bitter tang of her own reflection. For once, she had no script, no comeback, and that terrified her. Ashley's laughter had shriveled to silence. She leaned forward now, craning her neck in an attempt to read over Mom's shoulder. "What even is that?" she demanded. But this time her voice wavered. The sharpness dulled into something thinner, less certain, as if the air had turned too heavy for her usual bravado. No one answered. The room had become a vacuum, and Uncle Frank, ever the parasite of discomfort, scratched at his chin, his smugness withering into something awkward and restless. Tyler slouched deeper into his chair, his face flushed with confusion and discomfort. His gaze darted toward me, searching for someone to crack a joke to shatter the unbearable stillness. But no joke came. The silence belonged to me now. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel suffocated by it. I didn't feel small inside it. I didn't need to scream or explain. I had already spoken every truth that needed saying in that letter, and letting them sit with it, letting it smother them in its undeniable weight, was more powerful than any words I could have shouted. They had tried to reduce me to nothing on my birthday, tried to crush me beneath the weight of their laughter and contempt. But I had turned their cruelty into a mirror, and now they had no choice but to look at their own distorted reflections. Karen's eyes lingered on the page, slower now, like each sentence demanded more air, more effort to absorb. Her lips twitched, betraying the war within as she fought to hold her mask in place, but it wasn't working. The muscles around her mouth quivered, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. I had imagined this moment so many nights, sometimes picturing her tearing the letter in half, laughing it off like some adolescent tantrum, sometimes tossing it aside without even reading it. But I never imagined what actually happened. She folded the letter carefully, almost reverently, and just sat there holding it like it was something fragile. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, ringing in my ears like static. Ashley fidgeted now, her swagger gone, replaced with something closer to panic. Seriously? What does it say? Her voice was smaller, thinner than I'd ever heard it, stripped of its usual venom. Karen didn't respond. She just stared at me. Not through me, not past me, at me. And for the first time in years, I felt her see me not as an obligation, not as a disappointment to be corrected, but as a person. As her daughter. Maybe even as someone she didn't fully know. When she finally spoke, her voice came out soft, raspy, unsteady. "You wrote this." I nodded, calm, steady, my heartbeat loud in my ears, but my body unmoving. I didn't flinch. She blinked slowly, and I noticed her hand trembling around the edges of the folded paper. "Why didn't you ever say something before she asked?" The question almost made me laugh. Why hadn't I? I had tried. I had begged for crumbs of attention, shrunk myself to fit the hollow spaces they offered, bent myself backward trying to meet their impossible expectations. But all I said was, "I didn't think you'd listen." It hit her like a slap, her gaze dropping back to the letter as though reading it again might soften the impact. Ashley glanced between us, restless, desperate to reclaim control. "So what, you're just gonna throw a guilt trip and act like you're the victim now?" She snapped, but her voice cracked at the edges. I turned to her, my voice calm and clear as glass. "Ashley, you called me empty on my birthday." She froze. The words landed like a punch to the gut. It was the first time I had ever called her out directly, and I saw her chest rise too fast, her lips part, as if to fire back, but no words came. Uncle Frank cleared his throat loudly, clumsy and abrupt, like a man desperate to cut the tension. "All right, let's not turn this into some kind of therapy session. She's just being dramatic." But Grandpa Walter, quiet, steady, always watching, interrupted him with a voice soft yet ironclad. "No, Frank, she's not." And the silence that followed was heavier than before. Grandpa Walter had barely uttered a word all night, his silence as steadfast and weathered as the cane gripped tightly between his gnarled hands. Yet now his back straightened against the years carved deep into his bones, and when he spoke, his voice, though soft, rippled through the room like an unexpected current, breaking through still, stagnant waters. "She's the only one in this house who's had the courage to say what's needed saying." He murmured, the quiet authority in his tone cutting sharper than any shout. His gaze swept slowly across the stunned faces at the table, pausing on each, as if daring them to contradict him. Maybe if we'd stopped mocking her and started listening a long time ago, things wouldn't have come to this. The words hung there heavy and irreversible, coating the air like fog, suffocating the bitter laughter that had only moments ago filled the room. No one dared to speak, as if Grandpa's rare defense had broken something sacred, or perhaps something rotten that no one knew how to mend. For a heartbeat, I sat frozen, unsure how to move, how to breathe. I had prepared myself for rejection, for the smirks, the ridicule, the sneers that always followed any attempt I made to speak my truth. But this fracture in the surface, this tiny crack of possibility that maybe someone understood, left me disoriented, like a ship losing sight of the familiar shore. I looked at Grandpa, and he returned my gaze with that same quiet nod he'd always given me in passing, the one that tonight said more than all the noise in the room. Karen let out a long, ragged breath, the sound of it sharp against the stillness. "I didn't know," she whispered almost to herself, almost as though the admission cost her something. "I didn't know you were hurting like this." I could have listed the birthdays they forgot, the hollow seats at school, plays the nights I cried myself to sleep behind a locked door, the countless conversations where I was talked over like a piece of furniture, but I didn't. There was no need to unspool the entire history of my loneliness. I met her eyes steady and simply said, "Now you do," and that was enough. I stood then, not to make a scene, not to hurl accusations, not to flounce out in tears like they might have expected, but to leave on my own terms, with my dignity intact, as if gathering the fractured pieces of myself and stepping fully into my own skin. I pulled my worn jacket from the back of the chair, the familiar fabric grounding me in this surreal moment, and looked at them one final time, this family who had never truly seen me. My voice, when it came, was calm, almost gentle. "I'm going to be okay," I told them, letting the words settle like an anchor, with or without you. And then, without waiting for a reply, I turned and walked out the front door into the cold breath of the night. Outside, the air was crisp, almost painfully sharp against my flushed skin, and I realized with a start how suffocating the house had been, how thick the air inside those walls had grown over the years. I stood motionless on the porch, my hands clutching the lapels of my jacket, my heart galloping in my chest like it was trying to catch up with everything I had just done. But I didn't cry. I didn't collapse under the weight of it all. Instead, I breathed deep, slow, deliberate breaths that filled my lungs with something I hadn't tasted in a long time: freedom. The next day was a study in silence. No texts, no awkward knocks at my bedroom door, no sarcastic remarks over burnt toast. I think they simply didn't know what to do with the truth I had handed them, raw and unapologetic. I had laid my pain bare on the table, exposed the ugly, tender parts they had always dismissed, and then I had walked away. And that sudden, irreversible shift in power left them paralyzed, speechless, in a way they never had been before. For a while, I wasn't sure how to feel. There was a lightness, yes, a buoyancy to my steps that came with releasing the weight of their expectations. Relief, definitely a relief so profound it made my chest ache. But underneath it all was an ache, a hollow sadness that gnawed at me in the quiet moments. Because no matter how much they had hurt me, no matter how much I told myself I didn't need them, a small part of me still wanted to be loved by them. I wanted Karen to hug me and say she was sorry. I wanted Ashley to knock on my door to finally see me. I wanted Tyler to ask if I was okay. I wanted anyone to tell me they were proud of me. But wanting something doesn't mean it'll come. And healing, I was beginning to understand, doesn't always wear the face of reconciliation. A few days later, there was a soft knock at my bedroom door, gentle, patient, nothing like the thudding demands I was used to. When I opened it, Grandpa stood there leaning heavily on his cane, his eyes soft heavy with things unsaid. He didn't speak much. He simply handed me an envelope, his hand shaking slightly before offering me a small, weary smile and walking away. Inside was a note written in his unmistakable, shaky handwriting. "You're not wrong, Sarah. I've seen it. I should have spoken up sooner. You are not empty. You are powerful. Keep going." That letter didn't erase the years of silence or the bruises left by all the things they'd never said, but it meant something. It reminded me that even if most of them didn't understand, someone did, and sometimes that's enough to keep walking forward. 2 weeks later, I moved out. I found a cramped little room above the bookstore where I worked. The rent stretched my paycheck thin, but it was mine. The walls became a mosaic of sticky notes, scribbled with story ideas, fragments of poems, scraps of dreams I was finally giving myself permission to chase. My desk overflowed with pens and half-drunk coffee mugs, and there was an old radio that played forgotten songs from a dusty era I found myself falling in love with. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time it felt like me. I got into that writing program I told them about in the letter. I start in the fall. And for the first time in my life, I am building something entirely of my own. Not to impress anyone, not to prove I deserve a seat at the table, but because I want to, because I have stories to tell, because I deserve to be heard. And when my birthday came again, I celebrated it differently. A quiet evening with 2 friends from the bookstore, no empty boxes, no fake smiles, just warmth, laughter, and chocolate cake. My favorite. Looking back, I realize I don't hate them. I really don't. I think they were hurting too, each of them drowning in their own silent battles. But pain is never an excuse for cruelty, and silence is not strength. And if you, reader, have ever felt like the black sheep, the invisible one, the disappointment in the family portrait, you need to know this: you are not an empty box. You are a story still unfolding, and you get to decide how the next chapter ends. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to scream or fight or try to fix what's broken. Sometimes the bravest thing is to speak your truth and walk out the door with your head held high. Because healing doesn't always look like mending old wounds. Sometimes it looks like building something new entirely. If my story resonates with you even a little, if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or like you were never enough for the people who should have loved you, most know that you're not alone. Your story matters. And if these words spoke to you, I hope you'll share them with a friend, with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe even with a sibling who needs to understand. Like this story, if it stirred something in you, it helps more than you know. And if you want more stories like this, honest, raw, a little messy, subscribe, turn on notifications, and join me for what's next. Because this isn't the end. Not by a long shot. Until next time, be loud even in your quiet moments. Be honest even if your voice trembles. And never stop telling your story.